Today I'm going to show you how to shade with graphite to make your pencil sketches look more like a black and white photograph. I'm also going to share how to get quality art supplies on a budget. Hi, I'm Lisa, the artist behind Lachri Fine Art. You may remember me from YouTube films such as Super Awkward Artist Paints a Portrait and Artist Thinks a Wiggly TV Tray is a Good Surface to Film a Drawing on. I'm asked all the time about cheap but good art supplies. While cheap and good don't generally go hand in hand, there are absolutely some ways that you can get started on a budget. I'm working on a set of videos to show you how you can still use professional and archival supplies without having to take out a loan. If you're not new to graphite, you're not interested in this information, go ahead and skip here for the project. Now, if you're a beginner and you are looking at this thinking, oh my gosh, this is too advanced, I can't do this, that's absolutely not true. It is a great project for beginners. And I'm going to be sharing 5 tips throughout this video, 5 big tips that are going to help you to make your work look more realistic. The supplies that I'm going to be showing you today run right around $40 if you buy them online. But if you're careful and you go to your local art supply store with your friends or family, have them all have different apps, if it's Hobby Lobby or Michael's for their coupons, you can save so much money, especially on some of the more expensive items like the paper or the pencils themselves. So that $40 you can easily cut down to less than $30 if you're using those coupons, depending on how many coupons you're able to use. So first, let's talk about the paper. In this project, I'm using Strathmore Drawing. This is their medium paper. It's the 400 series. And this one's a little bit of an off-white color, as you can see on the rows there. This paper is not terribly heavyweight. It's fairly flimsy. So it's not my absolute favorite paper, but it's inexpensive and it is archival. It is acid-free or pH neutral. You're fine to use this on work that you're planning to sell. And it's a decent surface. It's not quite as smooth as what I like with like the hot press watercolor paper from Fabriano or from Arches, but it still is a decent paper, very inexpensive to get started. And when you're first learning, you probably don't want to get super expensive paper. Now you're going to be more prone to having the work come out a little bit grainy, gritty compared to what I can do on Fabriano Artistico, but it's still a really nice paper considering how inexpensive it is. Next on our list are the graphite pencils. Now, technically, if you just have one pencil, like the General's Layout Extra Black, I used just that pencil for years. If you have just one pencil, you can still shade from that. Don't feel like you can't do something very similar to what I'm going to show you today if you don't have all the pencils. But I really like this set from Faber-Castell. It's their 9000 art set. Very smooth. You don't have a lot of, I don't know if you've ever used a graphite pencil where you get these hard little chunks, like almost like rocks inside the graphite. I have not had that happen with these pencils. They're absolutely wonderful. But graphite, they're all going to be archival as far as being light fast, so that's not an issue with graphite. So it's not going to be something where you have to worry too terribly much about the brand that you use. I like these because they are so smooth and they do blend so well. But any of your graphite pencils are going to be okay. The 8B is going to be your darkest in the set, the 2H the lightest, and so it gives you some variation. For this project, we're only going to be using a handful of these pencils just to keep it more simple. Next, we have the erasers. Now, there are a ton of erasers out there that are amazing, but again, just trying to go limited supplies on this project, I chose to use the kneaded eraser. I'm using the one by Faber-Castell. Any kneaded eraser is going to work fine for you, but a kneaded eraser and a Tombow mono eraser. That one is amazing. That's kind of a must-have for me with graphite, but if you don't have one of those, you can take whatever eraser you have and a razor blade or like an X-Acto knife and just trim down the tip of that eraser so that you can get a fine point. Not as good as the Tombow mono eraser, but it is an option. Luckily, the Tombow mono eraser is fairly inexpensive, so that's what you're going to see me using to get some of the highlights. The small little details with highlights will be done with that eraser. So those are my 2 choices for erasers for this project. Next, we have our shading tools. Now, quick tip on these, a lot of people want them to feel clean or be clean all the time. I prefer mine to be very dirty. And you'll often get these shading tools where it comes in a set with that little sandpaper block, and people will use that to sharpen or clean these shading tools. I don't recommend it. When you do that, you make the shading tool very rough. It's not as smooth. I want these to be as smooth as possible, and the dirtier and older they get, the more they work for my techniques. I love them that way. So I never do anything to try to clean mine, but what I will often do, as you can see on the shading tool here, I will keep one end more dirty than the other, or let more graphite get picked up on one end than the other, so that I've got control. I can choose which side I want to go with if I need something to be really heavily saturated with graphite or just a little bit. And this is great because you can scribble on another piece of paper, use your shading tool to pick up some of that graphite, and then smear that onto the area that you're shading on your project if you need just really, really light shading. And you're going to see me do this a lot on that project. You can also use Q-tips, or I guess that's a name brand. I think other people call them cotton swabs. You can use those. You could use a paper towel to shade, anything like that to blend. You're going to get semi-similar results. Now, a couple of optional supplies that if you are trying to save money, you don't have to run out and get these right away. But one would be a drawing board. It's kind of like a giant clipboard. You can get these at the art supply store, and that's a good one to use a 40% coupon on. But those drawing boards, if you use that and then some masking tape, you can tape your artwork to the board. And the reason that I like to do that versus just drawing in my pad of paper, the pad of paper, especially this one because it is a fairly lightweight paper, it can indent the paper underneath the one you're working on. So you can cause damage to other sheets of paper, and it makes your supplies just not last as long, because you can't really use those in your work where you're being very serious, because when you go to shade over it, those indents will show. So I do recommend a drawing board of some sort, and those big old clipboards, those work great. Another item that is really handy is a brush of some sort to wipe away your eraser shavings. You don't want to use your hand to brush things away, which I still to this day am trying to break myself of doing. You end up smudging your work and you get graphite all over the side of your hand. And you want to keep your hands off your work as much as possible, because the acid and oils from our skin, those aren't archival. We don't really want that on our paper. So a drafting brush works great, or as I'm going to use in this project, just to keep my supplies very limited, just any paintbrush. If you've got a big paintbrush, you can use that. That's a good option as well. I'm also going to be using a product called Glassine under my hand as I work, and this is also going to work towards keeping the oils from my skin off my artwork. If you don't have Glassine, you could use a piece of tracing paper or just a clean piece of paper from your drawing pad. That would work as well. That'll help keep you from smudging your work and keep the oils from your skin off your work as well. The next thing that we want to do is pick our reference photo. Trying to draw things from your mind, probably not going to come out so good, because your brain has a very different idea of what a rose looks like than what a rose actually looks like. So I recommend find a reference photo. And the reason that I'm going with the rose on this is that if your drawing is not perfect, no big deal. It's still going to look like a rose. Even you could be missing petals, you could draw the petals completely wrong, and it'll still look like a really pretty rose. Unlike if you draw the eye or nose wrong on a human. So if you are a beginner, roses are a great way to get started on learning how to draw and how to blend. Now, this reference photo I got from Pixabay, and if you head over to my Patreon page, I've got this loaded there along with the black and white version that I've already switched over for you guys. And that's free. You don't have to be a member to get that one. I'll have a link to this specific photo there in the video description. Now that we've got our reference photo, we want to make it black and white. And the reason for this is it's going to make it way easier to judge our values. Anytime you're going to paint or draw something in black and white, it's a good idea to change your reference photo to black and white too. Because it's kind of hard sometimes for our brain to look at something that's yellow and think, how dark do I go on the graphite there? But if you've changed it into black and white, it's really, really easy to judge those values. Our next step is to use the 2H pencil. So this is going to be the lightest in this set. Use the 2H pencil to draw out your rose. Now, I don't recommend, if you're freehanding, I don't recommend drawing it on the paper that you're going to do your final project, just because if you get a lot of eraser lines and you're going back over things, you can start to damage the paper, and especially this paper that is so lightweight. So what I'd recommend doing, if you're going to freehand, draw it on another piece of paper and then trace it onto this paper. And you can trace it by holding it up to a window where it's bright outside and dark inside. That's a good way to get started. Or you can even trace it directly from your computer screen if you don't have a touchscreen monitor. That's a way that you can go as well. Just don't push very hard. That's my other tip. Use the lightest hand you possibly can. You just barely want to see the outline of that rose. That way you're not fighting trying to hide areas where you drew an outline too heavily, because we don't want it to look like we have outlines. Cartoons have outlines. Things that we're trying to make more realistic, no outlines. So your lines as you're drawing out that rose, keep them really light. Before we get started on this project, if you are a supporter over on Patreon, make sure to head over where you've got access to the real-time, the 2-hour and 45-minute version of this tutorial. If you are unfamiliar with Patreon, for as little as $4 a month, you get access to all of my weekly 1 to 3 hour long tutorials. I've got a new one each week and over 150 that you can start watching right now. If you are not sure if Patreon is going to be a fit for you, you can check out my Patreon video library, and while you're there, you get access to a free 2-hour long colored pencil demonstration. It is a Margay and colored pencil. So make sure to head over and check that out. Even if you're not interested in Patreon, you get that free lesson. Now, if you got the full set of these pencils, there are a lot in there, and that can get a little overwhelming. So we're going to simplify that for this project. I'm going to only use the 2H, the HB, the 3B, and the 8B. I'm starting out with my HB. This is kind of a mid-range as far as how light or dark the graphite is. Now, I want to keep my pencil fairly sharp. If the pencil gets very dull, the graphite is only going to hit the top of the tooth of the paper. You know how the paper's kind of bumpy? The pencil would only hit the top. By using a harder lead, so HB is going to be harder than, say, a 3B or an 8B, and keeping it more sharp, it's going to get into all those nooks and crannies of the paper, and that's going to help avoid a super grainy, gritty look. Now, this paper can be hard to avoid that look anyway, so if you get a little bit of that grainy, gritty look, it's not a huge deal, but it's one of the tips that you can do to get a really smooth finish. Now, I'm not super worried about my pencil strokes going every which direction, and you can see the heavy marks where I've switched directions. That's okay on this one because I'm going to be layering so many more values, getting it darker and darker as I work forward. Now I'm going to put a piece of glassine under my hand because my hand was starting to touch the paper. You want to either use, this product is amazing, but if you're on a budget, you may want to just use a clean piece of paper out of the padded paper that you bought, but you don't want your hand rubbing back and forth on the paper. The oils from your skin are not archival. They will cause damage to that paper over the years. It may start to yellow because of any oils from your skin on it. Plus, your hand rubbing back and forth on your artwork, it's going to smudge things. If you look at the side of your hand as you're working and you've got a lot of graphite on it, you know you need to take some actions to prevent that from happening. I've also in the past used a piece of tracing paper so that it's still clear, I can still see under, but the problem with that is sometimes tracing paper will smudge things just a bit because the graphite can stick to it. With the glassine, nothing is going to stick to it. But again, not one of those must-have products when you're first getting started. I'm using an HB pencil here because this is going to be a slightly harder lead than, well, not slightly, it's a lot of a harder, well, grammar, my gosh, I am failing at that today. But the HB lead is a lot harder than the 8B lead that I'm eventually going to want to go with around the rose for the darker areas. The problem is if I started with that 8B now, I'm going to get an extremely grainy, gritty look. So by putting this harder lead in there first, keeping the pencil a bit sharper, it's getting into all the little nooks and crannies of the white of the paper better. So when I go on top of it with the 8B pencil, this is what's going to show through instead of the white of the paper, and I'm going to get a much softer end finish. Now, sometimes you may want that grainy, gritty look. That's totally fine. I'm just giving you tips on how to try to avoid that for those who don't want that look. Now notice that I outline the rows as I go. I want to keep those edges nice and clean. I mean, I can clean them up later if you get pencil on it or graphite on it. It's not the end of the world, but I do want to keep that clean as much as I can as I work forward. Now, for those tips I promised you earlier, the 5 tips I'll be sharing throughout this video, the first tip I have for you is don't push hard with your pencils as you work. I'm sure you figured out early on, if you push harder, the color comes out darker, or the value comes out darker. Yes, but you're also burnishing the paper. You're jamming that graphite into the paper, and you flatten the tooth of the paper in doing so. And that means you're not going to be able to get additional layers on top of that. What's more is with graphite, when you push hard and you really work that pencil over and over and over again in the same area like that, you end up polishing it. And you end up with these super shiny hot spots, which typically we want to avoid. Yeah, you're probably going to have some shiny areas with graphite, but ideally we really want to avoid that as much as we can. It makes it hard to photograph, and it just looks a little weird when one spot is way shinier than others. And there are matte finishes you can spray over it that will help tone that down a bit. But ideally, go ahead and just use a light hand to build everything up. Don't push really hard, and don't just keep reworking the same area really quickly. If you move that graphite pencil too fast, you really do polish that to a nice shine that you probably don't want. So here I'm using my shading tool to just smudge this out. And this gives us a really nice, soft base. And I don't need it to be perfectly smooth. That's totally unnecessary at this point. So here I am using a 3B pencil. So you can see now this is much darker than the previous layer, but still not jumping up to that 8B. And I'm going to do the same thing. Now here, I'm holding the pencil slightly to the side, and that means more graphite is touching the paper. When you do that, that means that your graphite is just catching the top of the tooth of the paper. And so I don't like to do that for my base layers because I really want to get that graphite into all the little nooks and crannies. But when you hold it to the side, it does go a lot faster. There's pros and cons, and it really depends on what your end outlook, what you want that to be. And I'm still not pushing very hard with this pencil. That's going to let it blend out really nicely. Now, graphite's kind of funny. There are groups of people who work in graphite who have this elitist attitude about never use a shading tool, never use an eraser, never use these tools that are really, really handy. And I don't agree with that. I don't think that there are real rules in artwork other than ideally use archival products if you're going to be selling it. But besides that, the techniques that you use, don't put too much weight on the people who are being super elitist and telling you never use this tool. If that tool is giving you the effect that you want, go for it. If you like the results you get from a shading tool, go for it. Now, of course, if you're not getting the results you want and somebody tells you, hey, try doing this instead, then absolutely try that. But you will find with graphite a lot of people who online, and I don't find this in person, I've only found this online, where people will just rip someone apart. Never use a shading tool, never use an eraser, never use fill in the blank. So when you read that, as long as the items or the tools that you're using are not damaging the artwork, I really wouldn't put too much weight in those definite rules that people are putting down for themselves. I mean, it kind of reminds me of somebody who was like, don't cut your lawn with a lawnmower, use scissors instead. Like, if you get to the same end result, I want to use the lawnmower that is going to make it go a lot faster. Says someone who has never ever ran a lawnmower in her life. But I understand the concept. Here I am using the 8B lead, so quite a bit darker. Just again using a very light hand. Now I'm smudging this out with my shading tool. I'm actually adding a fair amount of pressure to the shading tool as I blend this out. Now, don't feel like you have to use the exact same number that I'm using, the 8B versus 3B. Use what you've got. The goal is pay attention to your values. This is what you want to start doing. And this is a great project, too, for anybody who ends up wanting to move towards using color more with whether it be colored pencil or paint. Learn to do things in black and white and really get a good base understanding of your values, how dark or how light things need to be. And that's way easier to learn in black and white. And then you can apply what you've learned there to projects that you use color for. And this is the 8B pencil again, so the darkest that I have. And it's still not pushing very hard. Keep a light hand. And even though I know I want this to be as dark as it will go, I don't want to achieve that by pushing hard. I'm achieving it by adding additional light layers. Trying to keep those edges clean. Or fairly clean at this point anyway. They don't need to be perfect. And see how I outlined the rows where I want those crisp edges before I continue shading into the background. Now, one of the big reasons that I like to do the background first on my work when working in graphite is that it helps me to better judge the values once I start on the subject, the rows in this case. If I start on the rows, and this is going to be the case for most people, almost every single time, you're going to go way too light You then get your background in and realize, oh my gosh, I now need to go and darken everything up in the rows because you're up against the white of the paper when there's no other darks on there. So by going through first, getting the background, which has some of my darkest darks, it's going to be so much easier for me to be brave enough and really just judge my values better to make the dark colors in the rows or the dark values in the rows dark enough. That's one of the challenges that most artists really struggle with. And I'd say most of them at first, but I've seen artists who have been working for years who have a hard time with this. Getting your darks dark enough can be very scary. I would rather see someone go too dark on something than not dark enough. And that is something I just see so often, and especially in graphite. I've seen that a lot where people were drawing or painting portraits. I can't tell you how many white Will Smiths I've seen over the years just because they were too afraid to go too dark with those pencils. Most artists, just keep this in mind, most artists are not going to go dark enough. Be brave. Get those dark colors dark enough. Let your light colors be light enough. Get that high contrast. That's going to make a huge difference in your work. Now, another thing to point out, whenever you're watching a time-lapse video, I think they are super helpful to show you the layering process and to learn different things. But always remember, these are extremely sped up. I spent 2 days on this project. This is not something that you're going to get done in 45 minutes and have it look like this. Slow down. That is my next big tip for you on making your work look more realistic. Tip number 2, slow down. Take your time. Don't rush through things. It's so easy to look at a video like this and feel like, oh my gosh, I should be able to have this done in 20 minutes or 30 minutes. If I can't, I'm not very good. That's not the case. The speed that you work is no indication of how good of an artist you are. Take your time, really pay attention to those details, and keep your edges clean. I mean, that's what I'm doing here. Don't just start scribbling everywhere. Now, sometimes that gives you a cool effect. I'm not saying you can never do that, but don't do that for everything. Take your time, work slow, and especially once we get onto these petals, that's a big deal. Work slow. Now, I don't need this background to be exactly like the reference photo. That's no big deal to me. I just wanted to have a soft, sort of out of focus, blurry look here. Now, these areas that I'm making really dark, one of the big bonuses with that too is when I start working on those flower petals, and which I think I called leaves earlier. I'm probably going to do that a million times later. You guys will know what I mean. But if I make this area dark, it's going to make the light areas of the rows appear that much lighter. One of the problems that a lot of people have is that they will say, well, I can't make my lights any lighter. They're too dark. I already either shaded them too much, but they're not light enough. If your lights ever appear to you to not be bright enough, make what's next to it darker. And that will make, in comparison, the lights will appear to be that much brighter. So now we're going to start onto the flower petals. Big tip, which is not one of my 5 tips, just a different tip. Work one flower petal at a time. Hey, look, I didn't call it a leaf that time. One flower petal at a time. Really focus on the details. And look, when you're working on a flower, look at it as abstract shapes. If you are looking at your reference photo and you're just trying to draw a flower petal, your brain's going to try to take over and go, I know what a flower petal looks like. I got this. You can just stop looking at the reference photo. I've got it. And you don't. It won't look right. It's going to look very weird on its own. What the heck is that? That doesn't look like anything. But trust your reference photo, where are your lights, where are your darks. It doesn't have to be exact on a flower, so don't stress yourself out about it being perfect. But you do want to pay attention to these weird abstract shapes that you're going to see in that reference photo and try to copy that. In the end, it's all going to come together. Now there I used a kneaded eraser. One of the things that I love about kneaded erasers is that I will ball it up and then just dab an area that I want to be a little bit lighter. I don't like typically to take an eraser on artwork and scrub it back and forth side to side. It smears things depending on the type of eraser you're working with. Sometimes it'll smear things really bad. It gives you these harsh start and stop points. It just isn't quite what I'm looking for. And taking that kneaded eraser, all I have to do is just touch it. Push it against the paper. Don't squiggle it side to side. Squiggle, is that even a word? I don't think it's a word. But don't rub it side to side. Just dab it on there and you will lightly lift stuff up just like that. Just see how I got this nice mottled look? I got this texture that didn't damage the tooth of the paper at all, because the eraser is essentially going to damage the tooth of the paper. And there's just so many reasons I don't like to rub the eraser side to side when I'm working, but that is one of them. And that works so much better for me and gives me way better control, way better results than trying to rub an eraser side to side, with the exception, of course, of that mono eraser that I'll be using. See how nice that little teeny eraser cleans up those edges? Now, I do occasionally use other erasers. I've got some really nice ones that are more solid. If I'm trying to do rays of light or something like that, I'm going to use a more standard eraser. But I would say more often than not, I will go with that kneaded eraser and just kind of dab it on there. Now, what you're seeing me do a lot with the shading tool now is where I showed you earlier in the video where I've scribbled graphite onto a scratch piece of paper, rubbed the shading tool on it, and then now I can add the graphite to the paper just from the shading tool. It lifts some of that. It's kind of like using the shading tool as a paintbrush. Really focusing on some of these dark areas. Now, the first flower petal isn't completely finished yet, but it's mostly done before I move on to my next flower petal. It is going to be way too overwhelming if you try to work on too many flower petals at the same time. Do one at a time. Try to get it as close to finish as possible before you move on to the next. That's part of our slow down rule. If you could just slow down and really pay attention to what you're doing, take your time. And sometimes one of the best things you can do if you're having a hard time looking at it as abstract shapes and your brain keeps trying to take over again and draw what it thinks a flower petal should look like, turn your work and turn your reference photo upside down. It will force your brain to be like, whoa, this no longer looks like a flower to me anymore, even though technically it's just an upside down flower. It throws your brain off, and now you're forced to look at the shapes and shadows that are actually in that reference photo. It can be one of the most helpful things, whether you're working on florals, animals, portraits, anything. Work upside down. You will notice so many things that you didn't notice when the work was right side up, and it's just a way to trick your brain. Now here, as I get these really dark layers, these are being achieved by layers, not by pushing harder with a pencil. Try to refrain from pushing hard with that pencil. You really do limit yourself if you are adding that pressure again and making the graphite look shiny because you're polishing it. And those darkest areas are the 8B. And so I'm building up. For the most part, other than when I get into the really light areas, for the most part, I'm starting with the HB. Then I go up one stage to the 3B. And then as necessary on the really dark places, I'll switch to the 8B. But the 8B, there aren't that many places on the rose that need the 8B pencil. So don't jump to that constantly. Unless that's the only pencil you have, you can actually get something very similar. It'll just be a little bit more grainy with just doing this with an 8B. But if you take advantage of that shading tool where you scribble on another piece of paper and use the shading tool to get your lighter values, that's a way you can go too. I should probably do another tutorial, just one pencil. Now, tip number 3 on my big 5 list of tips, I don't know, I should come up with something catchy for that. But the third big tip I have for you for making your work look more realistic, get those edges clean. Now, this is one of the main problems that you can have when you're using the shading tool. As much as I love the shading tool, you have to be careful. One, don't overblend everything. Not everything needs to be shaded with the shading tool, and especially with these Faber-Castell pencils, I find that they do blend really well with themselves. Sometimes I'll just take a 2H pencil on top of the really dark areas, and that will kind of blend things out. Quick little side note here, notice that the lines, the curves on that flower petal, look at how they round off. They're not straight lines. You want to have those curving towards the intersection, so that makes that flower petal look like it's curving in, that it's folding in. Using the Tombow mono eraser to pull back highlights as well. But back to that tip number 3, keep your edges clean. Everything, like, look as I'm using the shading tool to blend in or shade in that lighter area. It creates very fuzzy edges. You do not want all of your edges to be fuzzy. It feels safe as you're doing it because harsh edges sound kind of scary sometimes, but you really do want to get those edges clean. So while I did go through with the shading tool and get my base layer there, see, I'm coming back through with a pencil, not just to darken things up, but I'm cleaning up those edges. Clean edges are very important. Now, that does not mean that every edge in your drawing should be clean or harsh. Sometimes you want a very soft edge. You want to look at your reference photo and decide which edges should be soft versus which edges should be harsh. That's going to be a huge deal in making your work look more realistic. One of the things that a lot of newer artists do is they make every edge so harsh they're almost outlined. You don't want that either, so you don't want to go to the extreme on things, but you do want to keep the edges that should be clean, keep them clean, let them be very sharp. But really look at your reference photo, and the more you draw, if you're thinking, what is she talking about? That makes no sense to me. Totally okay. The more you draw, the things I'm telling you now, come back and watch this video again. It will start to make sense to you. But that comes from making mistakes or realizing, wow, my edges don't look right and I don't understand why. All of the tips that I'm giving you, the more you draw, the more they're going to start making sense. So don't think this is too hard, this is too much information. I mean, it may be too much information right now, but eventually the information I'm giving you is going to come back and you're going to go, oh, that's what she was talking about. It wasn't just word salad. I mean, okay, it's a little bit of word salad, but not all of it. Here again, see how I'm curving those lines on the edge of that flower petal, and this helps me to create that look that it's folding out. Right now it looks flat, so I've really got to watch where these shadows go. Now, part of the shadows here, they're not just shadows, it's because that rose was actually yellow with those red edges. And so the darker areas here, that's what they are, those red edges in many of these spots. So this is where you may want to pull up your colored version of the reference photo. That may make it easier for you to tell what is what as you're working. But for the most part, you're going to be referring back to your black and white photo. See, I'm really darkening up that edge, but I'm darkening it not with pressure, just by more layers. Now, one of the things that I love about using the shading tool to apply graphite to the work is that when I come back through with the Tombow mono eraser, or any eraser really, it erases really cleanly. Whereas if I shaded even to that same level, that same value, if I shaded that with the pencil and then used the eraser, it's not going to bring the paper back to white as much as it will, being that I put that base first with the shading tool. And given that I love using the eraser to pull up my highlights, that's a pretty handy thing. You just saw me use the kneaded eraser there again, where I was just dabbing in it and getting that sort of mottled look. It gives you a really nice texture. It's fairly random, really, as you build it up that way, which I like. When you are working with anything in nature, you want a sort of randomness to things, whether it be certain patterns, certain lines. You don't want everything to be too uniform. So like, let's say you drew a flower petal and you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is the best flower petal ever. I'm just going to repeat it everywhere. I'm going to do the same thing on every single flower petal. Suddenly your artwork doesn't look good. It's too uniform. We don't want things to be too uniform. Using that Tombow mono eraser, pull out those highlights. I used to use, if you've seen some of my really old videos, I used to use an electric eraser a lot, and I've really moved away from that. I don't even know where mine is. I have not used it in years. They're a bit harder to control, and while I had used them enough that I got comfortable with them, they also don't get as fine of a point as that Tombow mono eraser does. So I'm going to use the shading tool for the next petal. Now, I would say one of the bigger mistakes that beginner artists make as well that really slows down their progression so they don't get as good as they could, as fast as they could, is that they stick to tutorials for beginners. They'll look at something and think, well, this is easy, I can do this, and then they just keep doing this stuff for beginners. If you really are looking to progress, if you're really looking to advance, move to advanced projects. Sure, your work's not going to look as advanced as the project you're working towards, but you will learn so much faster. I mean, the difference is incredible versus between a student who will only stick with beginner stuff until they no longer feel like a beginner, because here's the thing, you're always going to feel like a beginner. That's not really going to change. Don't stick to stuff for beginners though, unless you want to stay a beginner. If you really want your work to get better, start finding those tutorials, start finding those more advanced projects. Even if you feel like you didn't do as good of a job on them, it doesn't matter. You're going to learn way more from that and learn way faster than stuff that's too basic for you. I love beginner stuff to get someone started, just don't stay there. See, I'm just paying attention to the little details on my reference photo. Where are my lights? Where are my darks? Abstract shapes. And don't stress yourself out about everything being perfect on a flower. When you're working on a portrait, stress yourself out, make it all perfect. But on a flower, it's not a big deal. It's still going to look like a flower. I could completely skip flower petals on here. I could take them out altogether and it will still look like a flower. Actually, there's one on the upper corner thing. There's a weird triangle thing. I have a feeling I'll probably give this piece away to a family member as a Christmas gift or something. Before I do that, I'm going to get rid of that little triangle weirdness that's going on up there. I think this piece would look better without it. So that's what I mean. You can take out entire flower petals and it won't look weird. If you're doing a portrait and you miss an eye, it's going to look pretty weird. Coming back through with that 8B. Again, not adding pressure so much as, and it always looks like I'm pushing harder just because of the way my fingers are bendy. But so don't use that as a judge or a guide of how much pressure I'm adding to the paper. But I'm still using a really light hand as I build up those layers. Our next tip on my 5 tips is to keep your pencils sharp. Just because they're sharp enough to write with does not mean they're sharp enough. You want to get them really sharp because that's going to get that graphite into all the little nooks and crannies of the paper. Plus, when you get to this stage where you're working on keeping those edges clean, so that what tip was that? Tip number 3, I had to look at my notes. If you want to keep your edges really clean, you're going to do that with very sharp pencils. And you don't need the most amazing sharpener in the world. I personally, generally, and I've used several sharpeners right now, and I'll change my mind, I'm sure, in 2 weeks. But right now, I'm really hooked on the little handheld sharpeners. I have some from Faber-Castell I really like. I've got some from Coom that I really like. You can pick those up at any art supply store, just the little, like they're under usually $2. And those work really well. Now here, look at what a blurry, fuzzy, out of focus mess this is. This is a great example of why keeping clean edges is such a big deal and you don't want to overblend. Now, it's not that this is overblended yet, it's just not finished yet. But you really want to clean all of that up. And I think this is one of the reasons that a lot of people tell people not to use those shading tools, because so many artists will depend too much on over blending things and drawing everything. Everything's done with that shading tool, and look at it, it's fuzzy, it's out of focus. So that shading tool, I love it, but I always come back through with my pencils and clean things up. Starting to darken things up, so I'm using a 3B there. I don't want to jump to the 8B because I'm not trying to go as dark can be. Using that 3B lead, which is still pretty dark. It's pretty soft. If you are a new artist, this is one of your first projects and it's not coming out how you want it to, slow down. That's going to make a huge difference in your work, but don't throw it out. I'd recommend finish it, do as good of a job as you can to finish it, and then try the same project, or even maybe a different rose if you're too bored with this one, but try it again. Don't just throw your artwork out or get frustrated with it and not finish it. If you don't finish your artwork, you didn't learn anything from it. And this is something that a lot of newer artists will do. They'll do it, they'll get halfway through or maybe a quarter of the way through, and they think it looks finished, but it's really what I would consider a quarter of the way finished. And then they get frustrated because it doesn't look how they wanted it to. But they didn't finish. That was the problem. Finish your artwork. Keep working on it until it looks good. And even if it comes out not looking like you wanted it to, one, doesn't have to look exact because it's a rose, not a big deal, but you're going to learn so much more by finishing your projects. Don't get bored and start over. That's a good way to pretty much kind of stay stagnant in your skill level. If you're trying to improve, you've got to finish stuff. Now, one exception to that would be, let's say you were drawing a portrait or an animal and you realized that your drawing was just wrong. The animal was kind of deformed shaped, or the person, it wasn't right, eyes in the wrong place, not the same, things were off. Then, okay, go ahead and draw it again, make the drawing, that base drawing, perfect, and then come back and do it. That would be one of the exceptions where I would recommend starting over. You want to have an accurate base drawing. A rose, not a big deal. Doesn't need to be super accurate. I can take off petals, will still look like a rose. But when you're getting into animals and people, then make sure that that base drawing is exact. So if you started working and you're like, it doesn't look good, I can't make it look good because my drawing was wrong in the first place, go ahead and start over then. The last of my 5 big tips on making your work look more realistic is to layer. This is not a paint by number, and this is going to be true of any medium when you're really trying to make something look realistic. This is not put the right color, or in this case, the right value. Put the right value in the exact right place, and that's what's going to make it look realistic. It doesn't work that way. If you really are trying to make your work look more realistic and you're trying to do this shading, do it in layers. Build up to that. Ideally, start with the lightest values first and build up to your darker values. It's always easy to go back and make things darker. Way harder to go back and lighten them up. So work in layers. That's that last of those 5 tips I have for you. I know when I first started painting and taking drawing very seriously, I was looking at it as you just put the right color in the right place. That's how you make these super, like the paintings that I just loved. I thought it was just put the right color in the right place. One, color itself wasn't the big deal. It was the values that mattered. Get your darks darker in most cases, like I was saying before. But it was so much more than that. It's a layering process. So you want to think of it in terms of layers. Start with your lightest values and just keep going darker and darker as needed. Now these inner petals are still very, very soft, so I'll definitely want to come back through and sharpen up those edges, clean things up. But here, being that they get smaller, I'll generally work on several petals at the same time when I work on the inside of a rose. You know, again, I was using that shading tool to kind of draw in where some of the petals are going to go, but then I came back through with a pencil and sharpened them up. Now, when I talk about sharp edges, I don't mean go around the whole thing and outline things. We don't want it to look like it has outlines. Cartoons have outlines. When you're working towards something realistic, we don't want outlines. What I'm doing is creating sharp edges with shadows. So one edge will have that sharp edge and it will usually fade one direction or the other, but only one direction. Fading both directions, you're just making a thicker line. But I will put a harsh edge and then fade it out, usually on the petal behind or underneath, whichever one I'm working on. Just used my hand to wipe away eraser marks. So disappointed with myself. I should have used a brush. Breaking my own little tips there. It's a really hard habit to break. Now my hand at this point is resting on that drawing board where I've got everything taped down. It's not actually touching the artwork. If I need to touch where the artwork is, I want to put something under my hand there, a piece of paper or glassine or just something. And see how at this stage I keep going back to previous petals, because what happens is once you get the other petals blocked in, you start realizing how much darker you can make the values in other petals. So I'm going to start skipping around a lot here and working on making my values more correct, more like what I want. I also will get to a stage here where I stop looking at the reference photo so much. I've already got where my general lights and darks need to be. So I'll start to back away from my work, look at it from a distance, or take a photo on your cell phone so you're looking at it on a small screen, and decide what might need to be darker or have a sharper edge or lighter in some cases. But I'm looking at what will make my artwork better. It's not always about just trying to make it look exactly like your reference photo. I've got my basics down from the reference photo. Now, what will make my artwork? Now I come back through using my artistic eyes, I guess. What will make mine better? Because sometimes deviating away from the reference photo is what you need to do to make yours better. You can really see now, if you look at the center of this rose, or really any of these petals compared to when it was finished, now it's pretty easy to compare what changes I made. Where did I go darker? Where did I define edges better in order to improve it? But spend more time. Spend longer on the project than you think you should. One of the things that made the biggest difference in my own artwork is when I went from spending $45 on or $45, 45 minutes on a pencil sketch into 8 hours on that same drawing, really focusing on the shading. It was just a night and day difference. You wouldn't even think it was the same artist. Spending more time, that alone may be the one thing that will make all the difference in the world in your work. When you're first learning, you also want to make sure that you're using a really good reference photo, something with high contrast, ideally, good detail, high contrast. Those generally are going to look the best. You're going to learn more from that than from something. You can still get a rose that looks pretty in a photograph, but it doesn't really translate that well into a painting. You can't see enough detail, or the contrast is weak, whatever. When you're first starting out, I think it's even more important for beginners to work from really high quality photos than for somebody who's more advanced. Once you get more advanced, you'll be able to take a not so great photo and make it look amazing. But when you're first starting out, get those really good photos. And there are tons of free resources available, like this one I got from Pixabay. Lots of really good royalty-free photos on there. Lots of really bad royalty-free photos as well, so you have to dig through them. But there are some amazing photos that you are legally able, they're royalty-free, so you're able to use them in your artwork. And you don't have to worry about if it came out really good and you want to make prints, you want to sell the original, you can do that with those photos. And see how I keep working back and forth. Dark's darker, light's lighter, messing with things. And it seems minor, but all these little things really add up in the end. One of the things that I like to do, I will tell myself, okay, I'm going to have this finished in, tonight at 9 o'clock or whatever. I will then at 9 o'clock, when I think it's finished, I'm going to stop, take a break, either come back an hour or two later, or even the next day with fresh eyes. Come back with fresh eyes. You will notice so many more things that you think you can make better. And again, look at it upside down. Flip your artwork and your reference photo upside down. You will notice so many things that you didn't catch before. And so just keep layering. Gonna darken that up a bit. And obviously this is moving very fast. So if you're following along with this, just pause it. Just go back and pause, kind of get caught up to that stage, then move forward in the video, get caught up to whatever stage that is. I think that's really helpful for learning, and really any of the speed tutorials by anybody on YouTube. That's really what you want to do. I know a lot of people will complain it's too fast, and that's what I've got Patreon for. You can watch it in real time, or some of my videos on Patreon are like 8 hours long, so they're actually cut down. They're still sped up a little bit. I just don't want to deceive anyone or mislead anyone there. But when you are watching these sped up, super fast videos, just catch up to whatever layer they're on. Pause the video, get your work caught up to that stage, then move on, then pause it, and you're just going to repeat this process. Now, just to be clear, not every time-lapse video on YouTube do you have rights to copy. Not everyone wants you copying their work. They just want to show you their process. So be careful which ones you do that from. With mine, you're always welcome for your own use to copy to learn, except if I've used a reference photo you don't have rights to. I can't give you permission to copy that. You'd have to get rights to use that same reference photo, and I generally tell you where the reference photos came. But like something like this is from Pixabay. You guys are welcome to copy this one. But do be aware when you're following different tutorials on YouTube, which ones, some artists encourage it, some don't want you copying their work. So, just check into that. But here is my finished project. It's fairly loose. It's not as refined as I might do if I'm trying to do something a bit more advanced, but it's a great start, and it's a great project if you're a beginner to graphite. Roses are one of the first things that I recommend new students learn to paint, because it gives you control over making an edge look like it's curved versus flat, how to shade it. You can pretty comfortably learn all of these techniques without worrying about your drawing being absolutely perfect. So it removes that aspect of, let's say, starting with a portrait. If you wanted to get into doing portraits, I never start students on portraits. I always start them with roses. Learn how to shade, learn how to blend, learn how to get your edges the way that you want them on a rose. And then once you master that, move on to portraits or whatever else it is that interests you. But roses are such a good way to go. And I wouldn't recommend necessarily necessarily any type of flower. Some flowers like daisies, they're a bit flat looking, so you're not going to learn as much about making your edges or the petal look like it's curving. So that's why I like to go with roses. Those edges that curve out, there's a lot that you can learn from just that one subject. More so with these than a lot of other types of flowers. Have you subscribed yet? If not, I've got a handy button right there. It's round, it has a little goldfish on it. If you click on that, that'll help you to keep up to date with all of my new art videos every single week. You may also want to click on that bell notification icon thingy because YouTube doesn't notify people that often when new videos go up. Or sign up for my email newsletter. Chicken, stop talking. We don't need your input on this. If you sign up for my email newsletter, you get notifications of all of my videos that went up that week, some art tips and some other stuff, and that is also free.